Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming back so promptly. I hope the coffee was to your liking. Next up, we have Don Thibeau. Don is the Chief Executive of the OpenID Foundation, President and Chairman of the Open Identity Exchange, a not-for-profit technology agnostic organization of global leaders from the private and public sectors. OIX is a test bed for business, legal, and governance best practices and policies, and operates the OIX Net registry. Don is chairman of OIX UK and Europe, and is also co-chair of the OASIS Electronic Identity Credential Trust Elevation Methods Technical Committee. And so, welcome, Don.
Enough of all that. Thank you. I am delighted to be here. I'm delighted because every time I come to London, I always stay next door and I always visit the British Library. It's the two touchstones of my life, the Magna Carta and John Lennon's scribbles about Love Me Do. The best job I ever had was in grad school, where someone actually paid me to curate the rare books collection at my university library. I think that was the height of my career. Another part of my career was head of strategy at LexisNexis, where I watched almost in real time the loss of our franchise to this new thing called the internet. Years later, I found myself giving a series of workshops at Facebook titled, "Just because you grew up with the internet doesn't mean that the internet's grown up." And of course, here we are now, where we are obliged to talk about the Cambridge Analytica situation, which I think is important, particularly for people in this room, because it shows us where we are in history, where we have an example of an organization with unlimited funds. The owners of Cambridge Analytica are hedge funds managers with a very radical political agenda, radical in the Latin sense, not, well, in the political sense as well, depending. But they were able to take all those funds and basically buy all the data that they possibly could want, both on the open market and the metadata that exists in the gray market. They were also able to use deep learning and neural networking and artificial intelligence. And we live at a time, the very beginnings, the primitive era of AI technology. But even today, we now have learning systems that are self-learning systems. So we have machines that are teaching themselves how to learn and how to create new algorithms and new analytical capability, analytics, that even the software designers of the analytics that built the AI engines don't fully understand. What a remarkable time. And all this data, all this content, is meeting new business models that we haven't seen before. So it's a delight to be here, and it's a delight to follow the two presentations early. I haven't started my presentation yet, because I think it really captures the world that you live in and the worlds that you must master. The world of technology tools, which I'll talk about in a moment, but also governance rules. So the presentation that we began with was about regulation, about how we will govern content, how libraries and authors and publishers must cooperate in some kind of a trust framework, some kind of a governance system that they mutually understand, so that they can master these new tools, the toolkits that software programmers are building. So understanding the tools, the technology tools, which we learned about this morning, and the regulatory and governance rules, and aligning them, I think, is the task before you. I think it's the task before many of us. But let me move on to the more boring bits. So I represent actually two foundations. One is the OpenID Foundation, which you learned a bit about earlier, where this new standard, OpenID Connect, offers the opportunity for greater control over one's identity and how the information about us, as we saw in the case of Facebook, which is really only the tip of the iceberg when we look at that Facebook profile, right? Because each of those attributes goes into a decision tree of analytics about metadata about the attributes, right? So my Facebook profile is really a social grid of who I am and where I am. So I work with this foundation that is trying to really sort out the technology tools. And you are not surprised by seeing who's involved in this foundation. These are large corporates who see identity and data about who we are and the ability to know that we are who we say that we are, or we are representative of an organization that so authorizes us, as key to their success. We have a bunch of working groups. This is illustrative of only the fact that this identity and data and content thing reaches across different sectors, healthcare and banking and government, et cetera. So we talked about open standards, and I want to salute OpenAthens for its commitment to open standards, and particularly OpenID Connect, because the foundation provided by OpenAthens gives you a set of tools that allows you to build consent into the systems, the tool sets that are part of the organizations and libraries and universities you represent. And by having this tool set available to you in open source standards, it gives you these good things. You're able to interoperate with other systems, other platforms, which is a key to our success. So this OpenID Connect standard, it really was a 6-year slog of companies that knew that we have to move away from SAML to something that's more extensible, something that's more scalable, something that allows for consent and privacy to be built in so that it can be responsive to different jurisdictional requirements. You'll see that my friends at Facebook were very involved in this standard until we almost went live. Then Facebook deliberately stepped aside from an open standard and created a proprietary standard. Proprietary standards are really good if you want to protect your franchise. If your business model is that of a walled garden. The big platform players are distinguished by this standards approach, this technical set of tools that allow them maximum governance over how behavior and data and content is to be licensed and paid for and monetized. So Facebook, like Apple, like Amazon, has chosen not to adopt open standards because it reinforces their business model. Google and Microsoft and these other folks have taken a different business model approach, which means that they have to interoperate, whether they like it or not. Microsoft has to interoperate with Google and vice versa. So in some cases, it's the alignment of self-interest that we're looking at here that create this open standard, as well as individual developers, et cetera. So you're probably using this standard already. If you're using Gmail, you're using the standard. And that's the right way for standards to be developed. They become part of the plumbing. They become part of the tool set that allows you to do different things, more important things. So as I mentioned, this identity stuff turns out to be really important because it, as discussed earlier, is intrinsic to trust. And we're all in the trust business. We're all in the trusted transaction business where we want to be able to create this trust framework, in your case, between the publisher, the author, the librarian, the marketplace, because we want to be able to protect that sense of trusted transaction. So for the tool makers, this is the protocol suite. All this is to say is that it's deliberately modular so that these different organizations, be they governments or global leaders or librarians, can go into the plumbing and adjust these technology tools to fit different use cases. So OpenID Connect is becoming increasingly important and increasingly adopted because of this flexibility to allow it to be used by Google as well as governments. One of the most interesting things about this time and this place is that the UK finds itself kind of straddling one foot in North America in a, frankly, wild, wild west regulatory context where anything goes, more or less, and where the monetization of personally identifying information is the primary business model that's being funded in Silicon Valley by venture capitalists. And at the same time, the UK finds itself with one foot in Europe, where increasing pressure, as evidenced in new regulations, new rules like GDPR and other banking regulations, really are forming these two polar ends of the spectrum. In the UK institutions, Her Majesty's government, organizations like yourselves, banks here, have to sort out how identity is to be trusted, how these standards are to be trusted. One way that we've tried to innovate that is this notion of self-certification, which is, how do I know that my partner is implementing this standard correctly? Because if they're implementing the standard correctly, then I can trust the fact that their privacy protections are what they claim to be. So one of the things that we've been doing is to have what's called a self-certification test. Think of it as a trust tool. And it's a very simple thing, but it turns out to be very effective, which is it's a sum of two parts, which is we ask developers who are using this standard to post the results of how their software is conforming to this new standard, so everybody can see. So we have a self-enforcement mechanism so that as soon as Google puts up its use of the standard, you can be sure its competitors go through that code with a fine-tooth comb. In addition, there's a worldwide crowdsource of developers who make sure that that code set of a particular company or organization is conformant to the standard. And then we ask a second question, which is, we want a responsible party, an authorized party of that organization, to make a public statement, a legal statement, saying that those test results are in fact correct. By so doing, they put their most valuable asset on the line, which is their brand and their reputation. So the sum of those two parts, a technical test shared openly and transparently with a legal attestation, is a trust tool in this increasingly untrustworthy internet, in a place where best practice is that you assume no trust. Best practice is that you assume you will be breached. Best practice is that the Don Thibeau that we see when he signs on, we have to continually monitor that that is the same person. Now, luckily, or unfortunately, we have lots of technology tools that help us do that. We have these things that we're all carrying, which are constantly sending out 257 different unique signals where I am. Am I in motion? What services I'm using, what applications are open. It's remarkable. We're carrying these beacons with us everywhere. So we have a whole new set of tools, and we have to align them with these kinds of governance rules. So I talked about self-certification. It may be something that your community will want to adopt as you move from SAML to OpenID Connect, as you move from that old world where I was happy as a clam being paid to be a librarian to this new world where trust is an increasingly rare phenomenon, both in commerce and online. So these are all the good things about certification and OpenID Connect. We think they're important in that they become plumbing. If we get this right, the plumbing of who you are on the internet and how we authenticate that you are who you say you are, that you are an authorized representative of a university, that you are a librarian with certain access privileges, that we can authenticate those privileges and that identity on a continuing basis so that you can be trusted, so we can transact. So there's a whole bunch of this OpenID Connect stuff happening. Most of it's not particularly interesting to you, but it turns out that it's really important for these new banking regulations that some of you may have heard about, which is how do we allow customers of a bank to have access to the information that the bank has about them so that they can move to another bank or another provider or a non-bank. How do we do that in a trusted way, technically and from a regulatory point of view? So all kinds of organizations are using this. Here in the UK, it turns out this identity stuff, this trust stuff, is enormously important to the UK banking sector, who has to come up with regulations that will be in conformance to new European requirements, but still interoperable with whatever it is that the Americans are doing. So this open banking technology and debate that you may be hearing about really turns out to be important to the 9 major banks in the UK, which have had to create their own organization to sort out identity, to sort out these standards. Whether it's a banker or a publisher or a library, you must become conversant with these new rules and tools of data and content, of trusted transaction. In the US, the real estate industry spends a lot of time in a journey quite similar to yours. Turns out this identity stuff is really the plumbing of international travel. Why is that? We need to know who you are before you get on the airplane and while you're on the airplane. And increasingly, in an era of countries closing borders, we want to make certain that it's you not only on arrival, but on exiting the country. But we have to figure out how those standards, those tools and rules can cross borders. British Airways is the leader of this, not because they think it's cool, but because it's mission critical. Because the UK, just as it is in financial services, it also is in transportation. It's an international hub. The UK has been an international hub for content and libraries and books and collections for centuries, and it must continue to be that. An island nation must have in its banking systems and its technology, and I would submit in the world that you live in, of content generation, dissemination, licensing, and publishing, this is mission critical. This is something that can't be left to a bunch of American companies who don't quite pay taxes either in America or here, last time I checked. So I lead these two organizations. One is the tools that I was talking about, the standards, but also this rule set here. You notice one of our members, much to our surprise, the Cabinet Office joined our organization. What are you doing here? It turns out that gov.uk Verify, some of you may have heard about, is an ambitious undertaking of Her Majesty's government to solve a problem of identity and trust, which is in an era of decreasing budgets and increasing demand for services to the citizens' inquiries of government, you have to move services online. If you move services online, you got to sort out identity. So whether it's the challenges before Her Majesty's government, the UK banking sector, British Airways, or those of you in this room, this identity challenge is right in your lap. Platforms like OpenAthens are, I think, providing you a tool set. Discussions like we had this morning about the regulatory framework and the importance for UK political leadership to understand these issues is paramount. So it's a delight to be here. I feel like I'm among friends because I see books all around me. I feel like leadership can come from this community because you're sensitive to the value of content and the dissemination of content, and that you're required to understand how technology is so radically changing the rules of the game, the rules of the road. My favorite stop at the library is the Magna Carta, which is what I call a trust framework. A whole bunch of warlords got together and decided that it's a whole lot better for us as a set of rivals, a team of rivals, to codify how we're going to transact with each other than the alternative system. It was really a brilliant piece of imagination. That kind of trust framework, instantiated in the Magna Carta, is the same kind of trust framework that was described this morning. The relationship between authors and publishers and libraries and other curators of content. The leadership from communities like yours in the UK is critical. Because in the absence of leadership here, we have situations like we've seen in Analytica, where the mashup of funding and data and analytics and artificial intelligence cannot be left to a few. It has to be democratized in some ways. And that democratizing function is what this community is all about. And this country has been all about for hundreds of years. Thank you very much. Was I brief enough to allow for a couple of questions? One?
2 minutes.
Two? 2 minutes. No questions. Well, great. Thank you again for your time and attention. I look forward to hearing from the panel.
Well, how interesting to see how things keep moving on from 1215 and Magna Carta. 803 years later, we're hearing about the latest constraints and things we have to worry about in our business. So thank you, Don.